welcome to the second debate of today's Battle for Our Mind strand on legal highs and club drug culture. Thanks once again to Wojciech, James McCabe, Simon Wesley and all at King's College London's Institute of Psychiatry and Drug Scope, Harry Rich and Marcus Roberts, for acting as our partners for today's debate and strand. My name's David Bowden, and if you weren't in the first session earlier, I'm one of the organisers of the festival and a convener of this strand, as well as being a columnist for Spiked Online. Now, whether it's shocking headlines about an alleged 52 deaths last year from the use of legal highs, or panic legislation to outlaw substances with diverse names such as Meow Meow, Mexxy, GBL, Ocean Snow, take your pick, the increasing use of legal highs amongst young clubbers has become a major talking point. Repeating the widely held view that the Aging Misuse of Drugs Act 1971 is ill-suited to effectively regulate the estimated rise of at least 3 new legal highs a week on Britain's streets, easily ordered via the internet or bought in shops. Last year, or was it the end of last year or the start of this year? The report
January this year.
Yeah, January this year, the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Drug Policy Reform called for a range of measures, including decriminalisation of some drugs and evidence-based regulation for others. In response, David Cameron reaffirmed the government's commitment to a prohibitionist model for drug policy. One of the questions, several of the questions that we want to try and unpack in this session is, do legal highs represent a major new public health menace, as many critics warn? Do they represent, in their sheer ubiquity, a game changer to the rhetoric of prohibition? Moreover, what does this debate represent a realist evidence-based approach to the realities of policing drugs? Or does it still seek to avoid the hard moral arguments over attitudes towards hedonism and drug use among general society? I was fortunate enough to take part in a fantastic debate last year with the Maudsley debates on this topic, and I'm hoping to, I think, recapture sort of some of the intelligence and nuance of that conversation with a couple of the panelists who took part and some new ones who can offer a fresh and different approach. Just to introduce them all briefly, so joining us to my far right, we have Dr. Owen Bowden-Jones, who is consultant psychiatrist and chair at the Faculty of Addictions at the Royal College of Psychiatrists. As founder of the Club Drug Clinic, he is one of the leading clinical commentators on the rise of legal highs. He may well be familiar to a lot of you. Sat to my immediate right, we have Dr. Clare Gerada, who is a GP who is coming to the end of her stint as chair of the Royal College of General Practitioners. And I'm sure many of you, again, will be familiar to you with Clare for her often robust defences of her profession on TV and radio. And she has a long-standing professional interest in substance misuse. And to my immediate left, we have Alex Linklater, who is a journalist, writer and editor, who has held editorial positions at the Glasgow Herald, Prospect, Evening Standard, and a former columnist at The Guardian. He's also a member of the Maudsley Philosophy Group and writes extensively on issues around mental health, drugs and psychiatry. And last but by no means least, we have Baroness Molly Meacher, who was chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group of Drug Policy Reform, is the chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Drug Policy Reform. Having had an extensive career in healthcare, particularly specialising around mental health issues, she's previously been chair of East London NHS Foundation Trust, amongst many other key positions. So we're delighted to have that panel with us. Again, I'm going to try and dispense with some of the formal speeches and to try and have this a little bit more conversational, but I do want to try and give people just the opportunity to just set out their stool, as it were. And I think I will start with you, Molly.
Right. Set out my stall. I didn't realise I was going to be asked to do that. I think perhaps I should say that we spent a year undertaking a review or an inquiry into legal highs. And we started off thinking legal highs was something quite separate. You know, there were traditional drugs over here, legal highs over there. And we wouldn't really be thinking about the other drugs. And Joe Hurlow's here, who spent a huge amount of time helping us with that inquiry, and I'm hugely grateful to him. But what we found was that people like the UK Borders Agency, ACPO, Home Office, all sorts of people that you wouldn't expect were saying, well, you can't really look at legal highs without looking at traditional drugs, because The reason a lot of young people turn to legal highs is because of the contamination of traditional drugs. So in the end, we found ourselves coming to the conclusion that if in fact you could deal with the traditional drugs in a sensible way, for example, regulating cannabis so that you had the herbal cannabis that you could get hold of legally, away from the drug dealers, and leave the skunk on one side, okay, let the drug dealers deal with that. An awful lot of young people just want a spliff or something, they just want something quite simple, or maybe even a bit of ecstasy. If some of those much less harmful drugs, on condition that they are clean, were taken away from the drug dealers, we'd have a much safer world. And also, in my view, we would go a long way to deal with the legal highs problem, because the incentive to take legal highs would have gone away. So, in conclusion, legal highs, in my view, are extremely dangerous. We are the king of legal highs in Europe. We use twice as many as other European countries, and they are killing young people, and they are causing the most ghastly problems, medical problems to others. And I know Bowden Jones, who's much better equipped than I, will talk about that. So if we can be sensible in our dealing with traditional drugs, that's the best way into legal highs.
Alex?
Well, if you come from a journalistic background, I think you would imagine that this debate comes down to legalisation versus prohibition in the context of a war in drugs, a war on drugs. And I don't think in the UK the war exists. If you go to Colombia or Mexico, you have a real proxy war involving military, paramilitary groups, cartels, bloodletting on a scale which we can't even begin to imagine. What we're talking about here is a social, psychiatric and moral problem, I think, and it's a problem that's it's not one of our major social problems. At the sharp end, it is a virulent one, however, and the question I come to this debate with, without a definite answer to, is there a real distinction between the new psychoactive substances, the legal highs, and our traditional illegal recreational drugs? And my instinct is that fundamentally there isn't, because although the debate gets framed in terms of criminality and harm, at a basic level, I think it's always going to come back down to the question of drug use itself, why people use drugs, what effects using drugs have, and what responsibility you, as the user, not just the society, the user has for those. And therefore, where does the law come into that fundamental personal, psychological, and moral responsibility? And I don't think this is a debate that can be had without the moral question.
I've moved a long way on this issue over the last 30 years, and any of you that followed my views will probably see that. I've now become a director of an organisation called the Independent Doctors for Healthier Drug Policies, and this organisation looks around, as she says, that the most important thing about those who take drugs is to take an issue about their health, and that is the most important. And all policies should relate to how we can reduce the risk to health, both to the individual and to society. And that should be the cornerstone of any policy. And I think, rather like many probably in this audience, that the war of drugs, and I accept that it's not such a war here, but it is a war amongst the patients that I see, the war on drugs has failed, or to quote Barack Obama, has utterly failed. And I think the issues around these drugs, legal highs, is actually bringing that to stark contrast, because where we could all see and think of heroin and cocaine as the bogeymen, drugs that none of us or our children would ever potentially touch, and things that were over there, the issue with legal highs has brought it much more into stark reality, as many more of our young people, of our sons and daughters, use these drugs, and some get into trouble with using them. I would rather they didn't use them, but I would also rather that we didn't criminalise their lives. I hope we're going to discuss the experiment that's going on in New Zealand, because actually I think that that would be one way forward in order to regulate the quality and purity of the substances that young people have, but not to set drug policies on the catastrophe that happens to some, but doesn't happen to the vast majority. So hopefully we'll have a sensible debate. But I must say, over the last 25 years of this field, I've become less entrenched in my views around legalisation versus decriminalisation, etc., than I was many moons ago.
I've been an addiction psychiatrist for nearly 20 years, and for much of that time, I only needed to really worry about a handful of drugs. Alcohol, there was heroin, there was crack cocaine, powder cocaine, and benzodiazepines, and that was pretty much it. And then maybe 3 or 4 years ago, we began to hear these rumours that things were changing. And sort of in response to that, what we did was we set up a specialist clinic called the Club Drug Clinic. And the clinic was really there specifically for people using club drugs and legal highs. And I very much remember the first day the clinic opened of sort of sitting there and thinking, well, you know, will anybody come? You know, is there really a demand for this or not? And 2.5 years later, we're getting 20 referrals a week. And I think the shocking thing has been seeing the extent of the harm caused by a group of drugs that have typically been called recreational. And yet we're seeing people with psychosis, with depression, with dependence, and of course we see in the paper these experiences of people having sudden death on these drugs. Now, I suspect that a large number of people are out there using these drugs without any harm at all, but there certainly is, from the experience in the clinic, a group of people who are really experiencing very major harm that is akin to the harm experienced by illegal drugs. So I'm sitting here on this panel really as a clinician, and I hope that I'll be able to bring some of that experience to the debate today.
For a long time, the dangers of what are now known as the traditional drugs were talked up, and often public health bodies would be drawn into having to give advice on something which they weren't always qualified to do so. We sometimes have to give conflicting advice. It's taken a sort of long time to have a clearer-eyed idea of the risks of the likes of cocaine versus ecstasy, the traditional drugs. So is the danger that the kind of legal highs are now being posed as a new threat again? Has this been a kind of new panic that's been created around legal highs? Or is the evidence quite clear in your view, Owen?
It is still early days. I mean, but something's happening at the moment that's very different. As I said, we suddenly got so many of these drugs being available, and they're also available in a different way. So people can literally go online in the safety of their home with a credit card, and the next day a psychoactive drug will pop through the letterbox. So this is the postman as your dealer. It's a very different sort of model. And whether that means that more people will try them or more people think, well, because they're legal, they're safe, I think we can have that debate. But I do think there's been a game change in terms of the availability of these drugs. Now, the question really is how harmful they are. But with 2 or 3 new ones coming out a week, that's not really a question of how harmful are legal highs. But actually, these are all different sorts of substances. So they're synthetic stimulants, they're synthetic cannabinoids, there are piperazines, there are a whole range of different types of drugs. So it becomes very complicated because we're not talking about one drug, we're talking about hundreds of drugs. And how do you assess the risk of each of these individual drugs when most people, when they're taking the drug, don't even know what chemical they're consuming?
In a way, I mean, it's quite wrong to say I welcome legal highs, but in a way I sort of do. What became very clear to us was that for the very first time, the authorities are absolutely clear that our drug laws simply cannot deal with legal highs for exactly the reasons that Dr. Webber-Jones has said. If things are being ordered on the web, delivered by the postman, that the authorities just aren't in there. They can't get anywhere near it. And it was very interesting to hear ACPO and the UK Borders Agency saying, our laws have to be reviewed because they cannot deal with these drugs. So with the legal highs, I think we are actually getting an opening up of the debate about drugs in this country. And it's about the last one in the Western world. But it's highly significant now that we have Nick Clegg talking about, we've got to decriminalise, we've got to legalise cannabis, we've got to do this and that. And then the other day, even a front bench Conservative said to me, I think this is something we can move on. I never thought in my entire life that I would hear a front bench person from the Conservative Party actually used those words. So legal highs are really shifting the debate in what I regard as a very, very useful way. I mean, legal highs, the worst of them are an absolute tragedy, and I don't underrate that at all. But Clare Gerada mentioned the New Zealand policy, which basically decriminalises the possession and use of legal highs and places on the supplier the responsibility for showing that their product is of limited harm. They have to do the research and so on. Now, my understanding is most legal highs actually come out of the very, very detailed research of the pharmaceutical companies, who of course look into many, many thousands of substances in order to come up with something that's really useful. And what the Chinese scientists, I gather, are doing is actually just going into all that research, no doubt on the web, and finding certain sets of molecules that will be that will do good as a legal high, however dangerous they might be. So the New Zealand policy achieves decriminalisation of possession and use, which I happen to believe to be correct, because I believe that to criminalise young people and give them a criminal record simply traps them into the business of being a drug, person, prevents them getting into employment, into training, and so on and so on. Bad news, it help, quite the opposite. So the fact that legal highs are sort of pushing us in the direction of decriminalisation of possession and use, for me, is a very, very good thing. And very, very interestingly, the first time there has been any question of decriminalising possession and use in this country has been this government, the Conservative government, introduced these temporary bans, effectively decriminalising, possession and use for a year. After a year, everything gets rolled up into the Misuse of Drugs Act. But it was a start, and that's in this country. So legal highs have done something already.
It's just briefly, actually, if it's okay, I want to throw something back at Owen, just a question as much as anything. As opposed to the drugs themselves and how they are distributed, acquired, so on, the drugs themselves and the outcomes they have, the presentation of your patients, is there any real distinction between the kinds of conditions you find your patients in as a result of the use of these drugs to the kinds of presentation you would find in the use of the traditional drugs?
Yeah. This is very interesting, and I think the first thing to do is just to think about which groups we're talking about. Because broadly speaking, there are three groups of people, or three experiences of using drugs. One is people who go out and use drugs and have a really good time and very happy with their drug use, don't really have any major problems, and they are our sort of recreational users. And there are lots and lots and lots of them. Then there's a smaller group who use drugs and may have some side effects. They may have some consequence of the use that they're not so pleased, and they may modify their use depending on that, or they may choose not to. And then there's a much smaller group who are the ones coming to my clinic who are accruing really dramatic harms as a result of using a group of drugs, as I say, termed often as recreational or club drugs. Now, what was really shocking, I think, running the clinic, was I also run a clinic up the road that's for heroin and crack. And the harms I'm seeing in these two clinics are the same. I'm seeing people who are coming in psychotic. I'm seeing people who are coming in dependent on their drugs, using grams and grams and grams a day. I'm seeing people injecting club drugs. So, what was startling really was just how it didn't really matter whether the drug was legal or illegal. It seems that for a certain percentage, the harms that they're experiencing are the same.
When I used to run a clinic in substance misuse, I had patients who abused Coca-Cola, drank litres of it. And also I used to joke and say, given anything, people would abuse anything if you're that way inclined. But the point is not what you abuse, but how can we protect you from, first of all, understanding what you may be doing, what one may be doing, but also protecting the individual, as Owen said, from the harms that those substances may cause. But as Molly said, to go down that route, down the criminalisation route, is actually, I think, for the first time going to be impossible. Because no sooner has one substance become illegal, another one pops up and you spend your whole time. So I too and pleased this has happened, not for the reasons that people are dying, but for the first time since 1971, we can actually, in a sensible way, with politicians involved, re-look at the Advisory Council Misuse of Drugs Act and re-look at the Drugs Act and actually start doing what I think David Nutt wanted to be done, which is to say, let's have our laws based on evidence and not political rhetoric.
What concerns me slightly about the legal highs discussion is that it seems to suit a kind of a liberalisation. People who have been desperate for a long time to try and liberalise the drugs laws, perfectly reasonable, but are not quite adequately winning an argument for liberalisation within society. That's why governments can feel that they can continue to sign up to prohibition.
I've been the complete opposite. I've been one that said that the law is the last break in use, and I was actually well against the reclassification of cannabis from B back down to C. And have for years said that the laws are there to protect. I think what's happened with this is actually, for the very reasons that Molly said, it's thrown dynamite into the drug laws and says it's nonsense, absolute nonsense to have trying to. I think there were 73 new drugs last year. You're going to have our entire police force and our entire borders agency trying to sniff these things out and use all of our criminal justice budget when it should be used on reducing the harms and preventing.
It seems to me that there's a risk of what happens is we move from a prohibitionist model to a slightly less prohibition, a slightly more liberal prohibitionist model because of the fact that the existing drug laws can't keep up. And it seems to me that it's not quite the same as winning a moral argument around drug use. The fact that you can't maintain this as it presently is, so we will medicalise rather than keep it illegal.
My position is that you have to look at each drug individually, really, separately. You can't say drugs should be this, that or the other. I mean, if you take cannabis, for example, I know that cannabis isn't a legal high, but just to illustrate an argument, really, cannabis is many, many, many different compounds, and you therefore don't want to treat all cannabis the same, because if somebody takes skunk, it's likely to be pretty damaging. But if they take herbal cannabis, my understanding is that it's much, much less so. And therefore, if you did have a set of regulations, which is totally different from criminalising people in general, and those regulations made very clear that if you want herbal cannabis, which is lowish THC, which is the active ingredient, nice, good percentage of CBD, this is probably going to be perfectly reasonable for people to take. They can get it in a chemist and they will not go near these drug dealers. So that's a particular policy that I happen to believe very strongly might greatly help young people, make life a lot safer for them. That's cannabis. But on legal highs, what the New Zealanders seem to feel is that if you could have a certain number of these things available that the suppliers had shown were reasonably, not completely harmless. I mean, alcohol's not harmless, coffee's not harmless, chocolate's not harmless. We all take things that are potentially harmful, but they're not totally harmful in moderation. So if one could have a number of legal highs, maybe an ecstasy equivalent, for example, that was available quite readily, perfectly legally, it seems to me that a lot of people may take it, but as Benzo said, you can take these things socially on a Saturday evening, no great harm, okay, and then you might begin to discourage people, and then you could have a hell of an education campaign about the stuff that really is dangerous, and you could also have very good information about, for example, these ecstasy tablets or whatever it is, on the tin. You'd make very, very clear the risks, the dangers, how much you should take, how much you certainly shouldn't take, maybe an age limit and so on. There are all sorts of useful things we could do with drugs if they were not just all left in an anarchic position in an illegal market. I mean, that's the trouble. We can't make any kind of sensible decisions because of the illegality of the whole lot, in a sense, I think.
I think we can boil it down even further than that, because essentially what we're talking about is risk and harm. And, people are always going to use drugs. There'll always be people who want to use drugs and want to get high. And most people, the vast majority of people who use drugs use it because it's fun and they like doing it. Nobody starts using a drug because they think they're going to be addicted or because they're going to have a major side effect. So, in a way, from my perspective as a clinician, what we need to get out there is information, as much information as we got about what the risks are. And then it's up to people to make an informed choice about what they want, what sort of risk they want to take. And I think the real challenge with illegal highs is we've no idea about the risk profile. There are so many new drugs, and they're being used in all sorts of combinations. We just don't know. So people come into my clinic and go, well, I used this drug last night and I felt a bit weird on it. Could it have done me any harm? And I don't know the answer, because actually there's no research at all on the harms of that drug. And so that's why we're in a more complicated situation with these 73 new drugs that came out last year. We're not in a position really to help people, inform people, and say, well, these are the sorts of risks you're taking. You then decide whether you want to take those or not.
Just on fun, briefly, I don't think fun even begins to describe the reasons that people take drugs recreationally. People take drugs, I think, to change their state of being, to change their relationships with other people, to change their mental state, both with nightmarish and with dysphoric and euphoric consequences. It's the change, fundamentally the change, that matters. And if you are changing your mental state, you are doing something which by its very nature is dangerous, and transgressive, and that is the appeal. You want to take drugs because it is a transgression of yourself and of people around, and your relationship to people around you. How you measure the harms and risks of that is incredibly difficult. As far as I know, the biggest cannabis study, I just think describing as just a spliff, is borderline irresponsible. The largest cannabis study I know of was the Dunedin study, which conducted over 25 years, population study. That's a hell of a long time to come to a conclusion, which gives you an indication of how hard it would be with some of the new ones. I remember Colin Blakemore, who was at least chair of the Drugs Advisory Council, described the results of that as demonstrating correlation and not causation, which reminded me of a scientist called Clarence Little, who represented the big tobacco companies in the 70s during the Nixon administration. And when presented with the studies showing correlations between smoking and lung cancer, he absolutely correctly said these show correlation and not causation. With cannabis, you've got an enormous amount of work, as I understand it, yet to do to demonstrate in any way conclusively what the relationship is between cannabis and mental health problems. From the Dunedin study, you would say that taking it in your teenage years, when you're young, is fundamentally a very dangerous thing to do and can lead to lifelong consequences of an enormously serious nature. We're not talking about deaths, and a lot of the risks get represented by figures of death. The dangers you're talking about when you change your mental state are mental health issues, fundamentally.
Claire?
I'll just say the word evidence. I mean, you're absolutely right. So we've got to have drug policies based on evidence, risks, harms, population use, acute and chronic. I was with David Nutt on the ACMD when we did this. The point I think I'm making is not that cannabis can lead to psychosis. Of course that Dunedin study showed, or that alcohol leads to people dying every single day. Of course we know that. It's to actually say, how can we reduce those risks and harms without going down a criminal justice route, but actually go down a harm reduction health route. So I think we're all in agreement. Of course the law has to be involved along the way, but I think what we're doing with legal highs is the law is now a blunt instrument because it can't keep up. And I think whilst they are doing damage, we should then try and understand, and as Owen's saying, get information out.
When we start bringing everything back down to the kind of harms level, it's that famous comment that everyone always makes, if alcohol was discovered tomorrow, it would never get past it would be heavily banned as any kind of substance. But I don't necessarily have a problem with that. I think that's probably quite good that alcohol has been able to develop when we're not obsessing over the harms. Is there not an aspect of the health authorities' jobs will be to try and understand these things and to give people good advice around it? But really, I think, do we not end up in a position with this rhetoric? We're saying on the one hand to young people, particularly, you can't be trusted with alcohol. There's a lot of concern over young people drinking too much. On the other hand, suddenly saying to them, we are going to trust you with with drug use?
The last methadone user I saw was injecting it. I don't think it's a good idea to inject a drug that's not even designed for oral use, let alone for injectable use. I'm not sure it takes much to actually start to say, look, folks, these are the risks that you're taking. We need to get the information out there. We need to make people aware of the risks and harms that they're doing to themselves. But at the same time, if we're going to go down trying to chase our tails with the law to try and make all of these drugs illegal, they'll just pop up all over the place. I don't know what your feeling is about that.
I mean, one of the things that always surprises me is how little information people have about the drugs they take and how little knowledge they have about some of the potential harms, I think particularly with the new drugs. And you see, you know, people who've been using club drugs for years come in and you say, well, you know, let's take the example of somebody using ketamine, which is a drug that I see a lot of in my clinic. And I have 3/4 of the people who are coming to the clinic who use ketamine regularly having bladder problems. So they're peeing blood, they get pain when they pee, and you say to them, well, you know, did you know that this is related to the ketamine? And it's just shocking for me that so few do. And that harm message just hasn't got out there. And if you can get that out, then when people start to have bladder symptoms, they then have a choice whether they want to begin to modify their ketamine use, rather than get to the stage where 2 or 3 of my patients have needed reconstructive surgery on their bladders because they've damaged them so badly through the ketamine use. So it is really about getting those messages out there, because let's not assume that people know, because people often don't know.
Can I sort of take us on to a slightly different level in a funny way? What we've had for 52 years since the 1961 conventions is an assumption, and it was a moral assumption, that drug taking is bad, people who take drugs are bad, therefore everybody must be criminalised. That was one assumption. And the second one was that if we criminalised everybody, we could eliminate drug taking. Now, I think that where we are today, 52 years later, is that people are seriously questioning, you know, am I bad because I take a cup of coffee? Maybe I am, but because I take a cup of coffee and somebody else takes something else, you know, are they more bad than I am? You know, I think the whole, if I may say so to Alex, I think the moral, or taking a moral position about drugs really does lead us down a really unfortunate alleyway. I just don't think it's helpful. So that's one thing. The second one, though, is about this drug-free world. I think Nixon probably genuinely thought he could create a drug-free world, but we absolutely know today that we can't. It is absolutely impossible. And now, of course, people are very clear. Human beings have always taken drugs. You know, even back in the days when, you know, people were roving around taking berries and things like that, they'd find a particular berry that did something funny to their brain, and they'd all go after that berry, whatever it was. So, you know, this goes back thousands of years, not even 52 years. You know, this is how human beings are. We like to experiment, we like to have a bit of fun, and it is actually fun to have a couple of glasses of wine and just feel a bit more free and easy, particularly for rather embarrassed, inhibited 16 and 17-year-olds. I really do think it enables them to have fun, actually. But that's sorry, gone off the point. The key thing is we can't stop people. There will always be people who take drugs. And now the debate has to be completely different, in my view. It's not about eliminating drugs. It's about, as others have said, trying to make sure that if people are going to take drugs, and a lot of people will, that they take the safer drugs, that, as Owen Bowden-Jones so rightly says, they know what they're doing, they know what is in those drugs, they know what the side effects might be, and that they make sensible, hopefully sensible decisions, most of them. So I really think that we are in a new world now, and it is not, it's highly significant, isn't it, that 20 US states now have legalised cannabis for medical use and de facto legalised it. We now have the 2 states, Colorado and Washington, who've legalised cannabis altogether, Uruguay, and Europe have now just developed a draft regulation proposing on legal highs, recommending decriminalisation for possession and use of all legal highs. I mean, this is a new world now we're in.
Just coming back to Owen and ketamine and bladder, I wonder how many people know that one of the biggest causes of stroke and heart disease in young people is cocaine. And again, it's And people are very surprised when they get central crushing chest pain and you ask them, have you used cocaine recently? So I think it is important that we don't stop giving information out, and we do it in a way that's honest. And I think you asked way back when, is this another scare? And I think our risk is actually over-egging what's going on, because we see small numbers, relatively small numbers of people that get into serious problem. And I think it is important that we don't do that, because if we do over-egg, you'll find out rapidly, because we're now in the world of social media and mass information. So I think you're right. I think in the past we did slightly exaggerate. You all remember, well, you're far too young in the audience, but the doom and gloom around crack cocaine, we all had to lock ourselves in our homes just in case it came and attacked us, and these rocks were thrown at us. And then we had the other scare of all the little tattoos, you know, these little stickers that were being sold, and they were all somehow impregnated with LSD and being sold around playgrounds to 6-year-olds. So I think we've got to make sure that we do not exaggerate the risks, and we do have a sensible policy based on information, evidence, and an effective intervention.
There sort of seems to be a perception that people are taking legal highs because they think they're fine and legal. Is there much evidence that actually people... Because I find it very difficult to believe that somebody wouldn't touch ecstasy because it's illegal, but would snort bath salts. That just seems to me an unlikely worldview to have. I mean, in reality, is this more of a sociological change within existing drug users than it is a huge debate for society?
I mean, the problem we've got here is we use this term drug users and assume they're all the same. And that couldn't be further from the truth. So, for instance, I have a group of lawyers who come to my club drug clinic who are all using legal highs. And they use legal highs because they know they can't be detected on an occupational screen. And so they're very happy going off and using Benzo Fury at the weekends in the knowledge that if they have a random urine screen, then that won't be detected. And for them, that's fine. Now, the majority of patients coming to the club drug clinic couldn't care less if something was legal or not. You know, it makes absolutely no difference to them. So I think what we need to get away from is this idea that, you know, you have a drug user. There are many, many different, there's many different drug users. There are people using drugs. And I suppose the group who I slightly worry about are perhaps young people who might be initiating drug use for the first time, who might think, well, because it's legal, because I can buy it with my mum's credit card when she's out, then maybe it must be safer. And it's certainly easier than going down and finding a dealer in Camden Market. And so that's the group I slightly worry about, is that they might be quite drug naive and actually have incredibly poor knowledge of drug use, how they should take it, how much they should take. And, I think they're more vulnerable to harm in a way. And I think they may be attracted to legal highs specifically because of that legal label.
Back on the history and the morality question, I don't think it's true to say that drug use has just been a part of human history forever. It's all been the same historically. It's had huge different periods of history, and the biggest one was the 19th century with the Opium Wars, which the Chinese consider the British opium trade to be the single biggest crime of the British Empire, and they certainly take a moral stance on that, and indeed ending the acceptance of a free market on opium production and sale in the early 20th century made a massive difference. In 1907, the production of opium was, in 2007, the production of opium is 1/3 of what it was in 1907, which is when the first conventions were introduced. 1/3, despite the doubling of the world population, despite globalization, 1/3 of what it was just over 100 years ago. That's the effect that a series of fairly loose international conventions had. And the idea that the law is a sort of, optional add-on I think is quite a weird idea. The law is your first state and social tool. And yes, of course, education. Yes, of course, evidence. Yes, of course, modify the classifications. But don't forget the basic principles.
I was just thinking back to the 10-year drug strategy that the government had, the last government, which dealt with all the factors of prevention, the criminal aspects, bringing people into treatment and harm reduction. But it had a big focus on prevention and treatment, and the success of that cannot be underestimated. We have fewer drug users now in terms of heroin and cocaine than we've had, fewer drug-related deaths than we've ever had. And it was a massive success in terms of drug policy, and it was a success that was around treating the individual as a patient and as somebody that needed to be treated, not as a criminal. And I think, of course, the laws have to be there. You can't go speeding up the motorway and drink driving and everything. But I do worry that the rhetoric around war on drugs, which we've had the rhetoric, which is really a rhetoric of a war on marginalised individuals, is one that will never be won. And it's one that I don't particularly adhere to, and one that I think we've wasted worldwide trillions of dollars and not really seen much effect.
Can I just say on the rhetoric of the war on drugs, I think that rhetoric, where does that rhetoric come from? It comes from the pro-legalization camp. Of course there is a war on drugs in South America. That's not $9 billion of American military funding helped make sure that was a war in the Americas. It's not a war here. The people calling it a war are not those who want the status quo, want the law to remain roughly as it is. It's those who want to change the law or remove the law. They're the ones who call it a war on drugs, and it's not.
Maybe the reason why we might be all hypocritical here, we may all be falling into the same trap. The reason why we're looking at so-called legal highs in a slightly more benign way than other drugs is because of the different populations that use it. And we may say because it is the young, predominantly club druggers, club users, middle class, it may be that actually we're slightly hypocritical, because I think the war on drugs is actually, as I said, a war on marginalised individuals. It's a war on the poor blacks in America. It's a war on, as you brought up, the Chinese during the Opium War. So maybe that's what it's about. I don't know, just thinking.
I just wanted to respond to Clare's point, how well the UK has done recently. It is true that as we have focused a bit more on treatment and devoted a bit more some more resources to treatment, and as our police services have in fact decided to downgrade the arrest of people using soft drugs, many police officers simply don't do it these days. It is true Britain has improved a bit, England and Wales. But the UK has the highest level of cocaine use, amphetamine use and ecstasy use in Europe, according to the European Monitoring Centre. And we are the capital of Europe on legal highs, which is extremely serious. Apparently all the legal highs that even go to Europe come via Britain for some reason. And their use, as I said before, is only half ours. So actually we are still doing extremely badly. Whereas somewhere like the Netherlands, people have been quite rude about the Netherlands policy on cannabis, but they have virtually eliminated their heroin problem. Their heroin problem is 1/8 of ours, has gone right down and virtually, they say, oh, we don't have a heroin problem anymore. We certainly do. So, you know, we are not doing well, but we are doing a little better.
Okay, I'm just going to see if there's... Okay, that's what I like to see.
A couple of people on the panel said that there's really no difference between legal highs and illegal highs, which is broadly true in the sense that they're all drugs. I think there is one important difference, which is that legal highs really don't tend to be very good. I mean, they're just not as good as your classic drugs that have stood the test of time. Their only selling point really is that they're legal, you can get them on the internet, you can go to a head shop and what have you. And this is proven by the fact that when they get banned, no one uses them anymore, generally. I think methadone is probably the only exception, possibly ketamine, if you count that as a designer drug. And therefore, in my view, the answer, very much as Baroness Meacher says, is if you allow people to have pure MDMA, they won't feel like taking Ivory Wave and bath salts and pond cleaner. So I'm very clear about Baroness Meacher's position. I'm not quite so clear on what the other panel, how the rest of the panel feel about legalisation and regulation. Would Owen and Clare, for example, legalise opium for smoking or cocaine? And if not, I don't think you're going to make much of an impact on legal highs. And if I could just throw a question to Baroness Meacher from completely the opposite direction, almost as devil's advocate. It's very easy to say that these drugs, you know, it's so difficult to ban them, they keep coming along, 73 a year and so on, so we might as well just give up. And I suppose Peter Hitchens, or someone who really believes strongly people shouldn't take drugs, would say using that as a get-out. You're just throwing your hands up and saying, well, it's impossible to deal with, so let's legalise the lots. And although I agree with that, is it really true? I mean, I understand the technicalities. It's very difficult to ban these things as huge groups of drugs. Everything needs to be defined in law to the nearest atom. But, you know, many of these drugs have been banned. The quality is really going down as these drugs are mutilated more and more. Is it not conceivable if we carry on banning these drugs on an ad hoc basis in 10 years' time, perhaps? We'll have banned all the main ones. The only ones left will be things so poor that nobody really wants to use.
I want to take up Dr. Gerada's point. When I took the Controlled Drugs Penalties Act through the Commons as a private member in the mid-1980s, I had no problems getting all-party support. Things have moved on from then, I'm glad to say. I would have had great difficulty getting all-party support for full-scale drug policy reform. And I used to get very fed up when ministers come into the dispatch box and boasting about the latest size of the seizures of cocaine, the number of kilos. It's totally meaningless. What was the test, of course, was the purity of the drug in the market and the price of the drug in the market, those two things. And, you know, I'm not being a skeptic, I'm in favour of full-scale reform, but haven't we got to face something much more urgent? And that is really learning from other countries. I visited as an MP in the late 1980s, injecting rooms in King's Cross, Sydney, not here, unfortunately. They haven't even reached King's Cross, London yet. Now, the Labour government, the Australian Labour government in New South Wales brought those in, face of great opposition from the Liberal Party. It's now got all-party support. It's got the support of all the restaurants locally. There's less overdosing, and everything is monitored. And, you know, like the Dutch do in clubs with testing the purity of drugs. And the problem we have is, as Dr. Bowden Jones said, is the fashion in drugs. There is a fashion in drugs, and it is accelerating. Just one anecdote very quickly. In the year 2000, in the Iowa caucuses, the two main issues facing Al Gore as the main Democratic candidate were the state of the pig industry and crystal methamphetamine. And that was in 2000. And now look what's happening with crystal methamphetamine coming into London, particularly in the gay community, the huge problems it's causing, cross-infection, HIV, Hep C. This is the problem. Addiction specialists I have sympathy for because it's so difficult to keep ahead of the curve. Things are changing so fast.
Just picking up on what Alexander said about why people take drugs to change their relationships with people and whatnot. Question to Owen, I was interested in your opinion as to whether drugs such as ecstasy, which break down a lot of defence mechanisms, and psychedelics, which can induce mystical experiences and so forth, whether they have a role in psychiatry in treating mental health illnesses, and whether prohibition has prevented research into this field, which could be potentially very helpful.
I heard people mentioning that New Zealand may have a useful approach for legal highs in the future. I was just wondering how people think that testing and quality controlling legal highs could, and like the mechanisms of how it could protect people from the harms of legal highs.
Okay, who would like to go first?
Just to pick a few then, injecting rooms first. Yeah, injecting rooms in Sydney, in King's Cross in Sydney, highly successful. We haven't managed to get it here yet. We do have injecting rooms, but they are where people are prescribed diamorphine, and they take the diamorphine on site. And in fact, I run an injectable clinic at the unit where I work. What we do, though, is we prescribe pharmaceutical heroin rather than let people come in and take their own drugs. So it's a step before a clear sort of injecting room in the Sydney style. But we are sort of making progress with that, and I do hope at some point we will get to an injecting room, because I do think it's just proven to work. Fashion in drugs, absolutely. I mean, you know, heroin, crack cocaine are in free fall in terms of their use in the UK. And the heroin users I see now are in their 40s, 50s and 60s. And, you know, people don't want to use the drugs their dads used, you know. Young people want to use something new, and it's at the moment the game in town is synthetic stimulants. People want to get high, and what they don't want to do is get sort of monged out on heroin. So, you know, there absolutely is a fashion. Methamphetamine is a very concerning drug. You know, I guess many people have seen Breaking Bad, this, you know, the TV show. What we haven't seen is the widespread use of methamphetamine through a drug-using community. But what we have seen is, you know, methamphetamine really taking hold of a proportion of the gay community and creating chaos in that community. And you know, the fear is that the methamphetamine, the crystal meth, will then be a more widely used drug. It's an awful drug, and I really hope it doesn't end up used in the UK. I'm really zipping through these.
Don't have to answer more.
But the last one I do want to touch on actually was use of drugs for research, and actually is the banning of some of these drugs going to reduce research? This is a really, really important point, and in fact I sit on the ACMD working group for ketamine. And ketamine has there's a couple of trials now showing that ketamine infusions might be helpful for treatment-resistant depression. Some very interesting work being done up in Oxford about this. And there was a big debate at the ACMD about whether reclassification of ketamine would result in it being more difficult to do that research. MDMA has also been trialled for use of PTSD. And again, you know, it's in terms of the hierarchy of harm, MDMA is pretty low down compared to some of the other drugs I see in the clinic, and it may well have some therapeutic uses. So I think we do need to keep our mind open to some of the possible therapeutic beneficial uses of these substances too.
Okay. Drug use, like the tide, comes and goes. Different drugs become more prominent and then they disappear. And I can remember, again, I'm getting old now, when crack cocaine was the real, and as I said, was the real bogeyman, and we were all preparing our services for this avalanche, because in fact we were being sold the fears that was going on in the States and imprisoning of pregnant women who used crack cocaine. We were all ready for this avalanche of users. It didn't come. It did come. It was about 10 years later we then started to see patients coming. And I was in Australia about 10 years ago with a methamphetamine, which was a disaster in Australia, absolute disaster. I mean, Australia is far away, so that they have reasons why they were using methamphetamine. There's very little heroin there, like very little heroin in New Zealand. And it's a worry that it's taking hold here, but it's a different population that it's taking hold here, and we need to act and we need to do it. But I'm not sure that we need to be I'm not sure it's a catastrophe that we were all told it was going to be. Coming back to this gentleman over here, and I respect your view, I don't know the answer. What I do know is, having been around the ACMD, which I was on for about 5 years, and having looked at the Misuse of Drugs Act and worked with it for many years, and having now seen what's been happening, in particular with these legal highs, I think what we need to do, rather like Molly's done with the House of Lords, and rather like the BMA has done recently, hats off to the BMA for doing a fundamental review of drug laws. I think we need to now be honest and start having drugs laws that actually address and deal with the harms that the drugs cause, the harms both to the individual and the harms to society, the harms acutely and the harms over the long term, rather like we've got at the moment is some sort of, cocaine is evil, therefore we must classify it as this, heroin is evil, therefore we must classify it as this. So I think I think this debate starts it, but I, like many in this room, have not got the answer, because I don't want heroin completely decriminalised and you can buy it like you could in Victorian days at 32,000 outlets, easier than you could buy a bottle of aspirin. I don't want that, but there might be a halfway point. I certainly don't want to be ending up with our prisons heaving, as they are at the moment, with drug users, especially our female prisons, where the vast majority of female prisoners are there for drug-related issues. Hello, Alex.
Hello.
Are you going to disagree?
No, I was...
You look like
it comes back to this question of harms, how you get the evidence for them and how you assess the evidence. Scientists are not the best people for assessing the evidence in terms of the wider social context. There is a strong move to suggest, I think it is a fallacy, that there is some kind of, there could be some kind of pristine measuring of the harms of psychoactive drugs conducted by research that definitively quantified them. I don't think that's possible.
See David Lancet about 2005, can't remember when it's published, he's done it.
Right, yeah. But his quantifications of harms are, it depends on your study design.
Interjected, it just seems to me there's a sort of question which is more important about whether this is a political question or a medicalised one, because there can be an urge, and there has been a risk that people try to outsource what is a political row for society about attitude towards legalisation to becoming a medical question. I think that seems to be the problem, because harms then becomes a slightly false way of having that discussion. It should surely be a political row about whether we want a society which endorses drug use, which supports drug use. That seems to be the question at its heart. But Molly,
just on one question, although I'd love to disagree with that, about learning from other countries. And we have to learn from other countries. Thank goodness other countries have been a bit braver than we have, and they've gone a long way further, particularly in Europe. Although now, of course, the US and Uruguay. And in particular on this issue of consumption rooms and treatment centres for the really severe polydrug users. In Switzerland, Denmark, Germany, Portugal, a lot of countries now have got this system for treating these people, giving people clean, legal heroin even while they are under treatment. Takes them out of the illegal drug market, kills the illegal drug dealers market, that's a thoroughly good thing, and also brings these people into a really good holistic treatment program, and people get better. 2/3 of them within 18 months are leading completely legal lives. Half of those are off drugs altogether. The others need something to keep them going because, of course, many of them are very, very damaged. So, yes, there's a lot to learn from other countries. We can do a great deal better than we're doing.
This is a very limited discussion, and I think it's to talk about this entirely in terms of risk and harm, which is totally appropriate for the professionals on the platform because that's your field, but that doesn't cover the entire issue. And I think when Molly said, well, there's no point moralising about this, I think you're right that moralising is something that maybe disconnects from young people or people in general. I think risk and harm does too. I think the medicalisation of these things totally it renders it meaningless. Because I know for a fact I never look at the dosage rate on a bottle of vodka. But I do know that if I carry on drinking after about 11 o'clock, I become a less nice person. So, but that's due to experience and my husband telling me these things. And that's to do with lay experience and the kind of actual lived experience of the person taking the substance. And I just find this is a totally dry discussion that I cannot, I don't know, you haven't asked any young people yet what they think. But I suspect there's a whole other discussion to be had about the morals of this. This is not about moralising, but I think there's a question that I think, as an adult, you learn to ask yourself about the things you do in life, and that is, does this make me a better person? Drinking wine up until 11, I think probably does make me a better person. Afterwards, it starts to make me a worse person. And I think that's the kind of question that I presume we want to teach young people to ask themselves, or at least tell them that's not a bad idea. And I think that's a moral question. It's got nothing to do with risks, harms, dosages, evidence, anything like that. And I think you absolutely disconnect from people's search for meaning, which may well be what they're trying to do when they take this stuff, by refusing to have any opinion on it. I think it's ridiculous. I presume we have got an opinion on this stuff. And just to reduce it and distance ourselves by talking about risks and harms, while that's appropriate for a medical professional, it's not for adult society in general.
Surely medicine, rather than politics, is closer to the human. Do the people in the medical profession think that politics has invaded what should be a primarily medical debate? Has politics been a bad thing fundamentally over the past decades, or is it getting easier? Is it getting better? As politicians, finally coming to terms with what the people in medicine are saying?
I sense that the chair and Alex have really struggled to make their case on this issue. I think generally with sort of generational changes in how people view these issues, you will increasingly struggle to make a kind of moral argument. However, I think that when we come to discuss this as a country and when the Parliament come to discuss this, actually it will still be fought on those battle lines. The House of Lords is a very reasonable place. It's used to thinking in technical terms. The medical profession can easily think in terms of risk and harm and the advice that's given. But when this issue hits that kind of public debate, we're going to be in a space where it becomes very rapidly a moral argument. And I think my question for the two medical practitioners here and for Baroness Meacher is, what kind of case will you make that goes again, that it can appeal to people in a way that some of the arguments that perhaps Alex would marshal in that debate will instinctively appeal to a more conservative public opinion?
some responses to the questions. Molly, do you want to go first? Or?
I think I'd just like to respond to that one. I think the others are more maybe addressed to the medical people. What arguments would one use in this if you like, political space? You're absolutely right. It's an extremely difficult subject to discuss what I would call rationally, really, because there is a very strong feeling drug taking is bad, drug users are bad, wicked, and so on. I mean, you get very, very easily into that. But I would have thought most people don't want their young people to get into harm. They don't actually want that. But what I think an awful lot of the general public believe instinctively is that somehow by criminalising things, that helps. It means people don't do things because it's criminal. And I think, therefore, to get across to people that actually it isn't working, that, as Owen says, there are a lot of young people who will, if you're an addict, you'll take a drug whether or not it's legal. It's irrelevant to those people. There are other young people who will take things because they're illegal. There are other young people who will not take things because they're illegal. And I think I would like to try and make the argument that our young people will be safer if we have a more intelligent set of policies, a more sophisticated set of policies, rather than these blunt, tough policies. And if people don't buy that, or if one can't persuade them that that's what the facts tell us, then we'll lose the argument. But I think that's what we have to try and do.
On dryness, I like that. Yes, maybe, and I like the way you talked about the morality of becoming a slightly more annoying or boring person after 11 o'clock, which is a sort of very, very soft moral question. Am I an idiot after I've drunk too much? To make it slightly less dry, to make it slightly more personal, I've got a photograph of my brother, aged 14. He was an incredibly funny and naughty and clever boy. And age 40, there's this photograph of him, and he's got a spliff in his mouth, and it's made out of the American flag. I don't think it's a real spliff. And we used to think that was really funny, you know, the children of baby boomer liberal parents, ha-ha. Anyway, a year after that photograph was taken, he was in the locked ward of a psychiatric institute in London, later spent every single year for the next 20 years having psychotic episodes of a truly appalling nature. And every single admission into hospital, most of them under Section 3 of the Mental Health Act, took place under the assumption that he was just a psychotic manic depressive and there was nothing you could do about it. And in 1995, there was a little story in the Times, came out on the back of the Dunedin study that I mentioned recently, showing adolescent use of cannabis raising the risk of psychotic mental disorders. And the penny sort of dropped. I'm not saying he was purely a cannabis psychotic, but every single one of his psychotic episodes, every single one was preceded by smoking dope. And they stopped after he stopped smoking dope. Now, this isn't about the general population. It's a classic story of that psychiatric patients basically do not fare well if they try taking drugs of any kinds. That's self-evident. But the story there is not just about, yes, we got a little bit of evidence suggesting maybe we could understand why he was ending up in locked wards all the time. But more than that, the real world that he inhabited, that we as his wider family inhabited as well, was a moral world. I don't mean that in the sense of moral judgmentalism. I mean that what happened to him had a moral effect on everyone. It changed his life, obviously. He's now got children. His responsibility for them is a moral responsibility. His ability to manage his illness, his condition, whatever, that's a moral universe he inhabits. And that very interesting question about what's going to happen when this dry debate goes public, it goes up in flames. Of course it does, but I think it's sort of inevitable that it will, because these things, when you go through them, they're huge. They're not just about a little bit more civil liberties or a little bit less law. At the sharp end, they're about whether your 14-year-old brother goes to hell or not.
Well, I'm sorry that I haven't been moralistic. It's usually something the opposite that the medical profession is accused of. I suppose as I've got older, I just am more confused because every day, every single day of the week, I look after patients who are wrecked by alcohol. And I sit there sometimes and then I see my drug users who have got a criminal record because they might have been in possession of cannabis or cocaine. I look after sick doctors who lose their jobs because they might have got an ecstasy, which they've picked up, or the sniffer dog has picked up that they've been using cannabis, or, they've got cannabis in their pocket. And I just think we've become so hypocritical about this, fundamentally hypocritical. And I know it's platitude to say, if alcohol was legal. Alcohol will never be made illegal. It can't be. You can't put that genie back in the bottle. But let's not get the other genies out and start, as I said at the beginning, criminalising a whole population of people, which I've seen, they're my patients, because of drug laws that make no sense. Somebody asked about the politicians. You can never take the politics out of drugs, full stop. Politics make laws. And what I would want, and the laws are there, of course, we wear seatbelts, and the only way of shifting behaviour, really, is to set laws, draconian laws sometimes, except in drug policy. Because it doesn't change. We just spent vast sums of money pouring it down a black hole and meanwhile ignoring the fact that we need to be treating people. One is, it's very boring to say, get the information out, get the evidence out, start having sensible discussions with people about the harms and risks. I know it's boring, but that's where I come from. So I don't know what will happen at the next election. I suspect, as I said, that there won't be a single politician brave enough, Molly, really brave enough, I think, in the end, when it comes to an election issue, to change the drug laws.
Except for Nick Clegg, apparently, who's already said so.
Right.
Well, Nick Clegg said he wouldn't introduce tuition fees or change the NHS.
Just coming back to the nice vodka lady over here, I thought that was a really important point you raised about meaning and how a lot of this feels dry and won't translate. And I think it's a correct challenge for us to try and translate some of the things we've been talking about into something that's meaningful. Because when you say, the real issue is, do I want to do something that's going to make me a better or worse person? What you're really talking about is choice. And to make choice, you need to know what the options are. And to know what the options are, actually, that's where the understanding of risk and harm does become important. Because if you're choosing something, you're going to have something to base that choice on. And I think it's quite an appropriate challenge to me as a clinician to say, okay, well, how are you going to articulate that in a way that people who are going out there and choosing to use substances are really going to understand? So I absolutely take that on, and I think that's a very legitimate challenge that I'll go away and think about.
The drugs debate is quite a frustrating issue because there is a sort of sense of people feeling as if they understand in one area, but then there's a kind of sort of cynicism about the ability to really change anything. Because, that's where my concern about the depoliticisation of this debate really comes in, because people, and that takes us back to where we started in a way, is that because people don't feel they can win a political battle on this, then it does start to become a medicalisation issue. And that concerns me overall on the debate. And I say that's somebody who is more than happy to see liberalisation within the drugs laws.
Yeah, it's quite interesting, partly because of legal highs, there's no question about that. All the political parties are thinking more openly than they did. And what we are now working behind the scenes on with the political parties is the idea of a cross-party review, whether you want to call it a Royal Commission, whatever, but cross-party, looking at the evidence and then having a cross-party set of proposals, not before the next election, but possibly immediately afterwards, because of course politicians are certainly not going to touch this third rail issue before an election. But they all know that there's a need for change, and they all know much more clearly, because of legal highs, that there's a need for change. And also we have, as we already mentioned, evidence now from Europe, from Portugal about decriminalisation, from Switzerland, Germany, other countries about consumption rooms and heroin treatment clinics, from the Netherlands and indeed Spain about making cannabis available just makes it safer if you've got it available in a controlled way, not in an uncontrolled way. So there's an awful lot of evidence out there that politicians can point to, and under this government, the just sacked Jeremy Brown had gone round about 8 different or 6 different countries looking at what they are doing about drug policy. And they've now appointed Norman Baker, who's quite a radical as I understand it, who is continuing that and who is wanting to get involved with people like ourselves. We've got about nearly 100 members of the Commons and Peer House of Lords, all wanting to see drug policy reform. So, you know, there's behind the scenes, actually, there's an awful lot going on, even in this country, across all the political parties. So I well understand why politicians don't want to touch it at all. And I believe the only hope is a cross-party approach to it. We have done that on 1 or 2 other occasions, but I think, you know, politicians like to bash each other, so it's not an easy thing at all to get them all to agree that a cross-party approach is a good idea. Why waste your time on something where you're not going to be bashing the other side, really? So it's a struggle, but I think we'll get there.
Alex, you look a little bit... You look like you had something to say on that one.
No, I thoroughly agree with Molly on all the technocratic issues, if you like, that you know, revisiting the classification system, examining the evidence, promoting more research, and so on. I'm just not sure there is you know, there aren't fundamental solutions. It's, you know, if you look at other countries, people do like to cite the sort of Portugal case or the Dutch case. Actually, I think if you start looking at them more closely, you find they're very culturally specific. The Dutch case is a case of pillarization. They've been doing this since they were trying to split up Catholics and Protestants in the 18th century. You have a little problem here, you put it in a different quarter. So we'll take prostitutes over there, put the drugs over there, and then the rest of our rather conservative society doesn't have to be involved with them. That's the Dutch solution, in a nutshell. The Swedish solution, they're both, by the way, Holland is very successful in what I think is the most important area, which is reducing teenage use of psychoactive substances, excuse me. Sweden is equally successful. It's very prohibitionist, even more conservative culturally about drugs, and very prohibitionist. They're both successful, one by being sort of quasi-liberal, one by being sort of quasi-conservative.
Can I just respond briefly to that? Sweden is a country that I've always had a great respect for, because they tend to be a very egalitarian country. They have very generous benefit systems, support systems. They really believe in getting people into employment, always have. They've now got a rather right-wing government, actually. So Sweden is not a country that I would expect to have a major drug problem. They also don't have our inner city areas. As somebody mentioned, this is all about, Clare Gerada actually, about underprivileged, socially isolated people. Sweden isn't that kind of society, so I agree. One therefore has also to say that Portugal, Netherlands and all the others, each country is different. But I think if you look across the piece, we do have a lot to learn actually from those countries that have been more thoughtful, more sophisticated and less criminalising than this one.
I just really strongly reject what you've just said. I can't remember your name, the Baroness. You've really described a really horrible political solution to this, which is really elitist. You basically said, behind the scenes, the politicians are going to stitch up something. And it really reflects an unwillingness to engage with the people. It is a very technocratic, anti-democratic kind of solution you put forward there. Because you basically said, well, we can't really talk about it to ordinary people. We're going to have some sort of cosy cross-party consensus behind the scenes. And really, it's exactly the opposite of what's required. Because what's required is a genuine discussion with people about how to be. And one of the issues of all of this, of course, is, from my point of view, the solution is fairly straightforward. We should decriminalise everything and talk to people about individual responsibility and how it is to be a human being. But of course, politicians aren't interested in that because in other areas, they also don't want people to have any responsibility for their own lives. So all this results in is a very technocratic kind of stitch-up where people aren't really engaged with and talked about how they can be an individual in society, but just basically technocratic, sort of cosy stitch-ups behind the scenes, which seems massively anti-democratic.
So there's been a lot of talk about reducing its use, drug use in teenagers, and I'm 16, and to take an example, I don't smoke, and most of my friends don't smoke, but it's not because we're worried about getting lung cancer later on down the line, it's because we don't want our hair to smell, and we don't want our teeth to go yellow, we don't want our skin to go all wrinkly. So I think that you've got to reduce teenage uptake in drugs, you've got to focus on the things that teenagers really care about. And even publishing about all the risks and harms, it won't do much against the easy availability of legal highs. How you can do it in the comfort of your own home. You can do it online without your parents finding out.
I just wondered if you'd agree that you could summarise your debate as to whether the current laws are more aimed towards regulating hedonism and whether they should move more towards focusing more on the public health aspects of all recreational drugs. That was it, really.
I grew up in the Netherlands, where you've got things like coffee shops and smoking things like cannabis are quite relaxed. Also, you can have your first beer at 16, so already drinking is a lot more relaxed there. Coming to the UK as a university student, I'm now in my second year, I suffered from major culture shocks in my first summer of uni as a 17-year-old and suddenly being exposed to so much alcohol. I mean, it's not even just enjoying a beer, it's you're drinking to get absolutely smashed. And that's something that, you know, growing up in the Netherlands where you can drink a beer at 16, and eventually when you're 18, then it gets to harder alcohol. I think maybe the UK could sort of look to that aspect as well, of maybe sort of building up the sort of alcohol intake. So you start with a beer at 16, then sort of introduce liquor, rather than when you're 18, you go to uni, your parents aren't there to sort of keep an eye on your alcohol intake, and you just go all out. First of all, it's not good for your physiology. It can't be good for your liver, and I don't know what it's going to be like for this generation in 20 years' time. I can't believe that they're going to be a healthy generation if at the moment they're drinking, you know, they're getting smashed 3 times to 4 times a week. I see, I'm a university student now. I'm not proof myself, but my friends.
Students worrying about the physiology of going out on the lash is, again, this is my kind of interest about this discussion is sometimes it sounds like we're being very liberal on certain drugs, but sometimes actually when we're talking about alcohol, we suddenly start to become a little bit more, we become less liberal than we like to think we are. But anyway, Claire.
Yeah, just back to the lady who's worried about teeth. I wish my sons were. They of course, grew up with all the knowledge. There's 2 parents with doctors. We forever told them, you know, from about the age of 2, don't smoke because it will cause this, and the age of 17, fag it away. I think the lady from the Netherlands just gives my point of view. I feel we are so hypocritical. We get completely and utterly obsessed by those bogey drugs called heroin, cocaine, things that sound horrible. Remember the Misuse of Drugs Act was 1971, was brought in because of a moral panic at the time. It didn't need to have the Misuse of Drugs Act at that time. And the more we use it, and the more we criminalise those people that we don't really want to be having any contact, the more we're not dealing with the catastrophe, the public health catastrophe that is coming up, which is alcohol in our young people. We've never had a generation that started drinking at 15 to that level. I mean, the previous generation might have had half a cider, what do you call it, you know, a lager, a half a cider or something, but the amount of alcohol, as you quite rightly say, and yet we pay lip service to it. We discuss legal highs because 53 people die per year. Was it 53? 50. How many people have died in the last year from alcohol, from all the things? How many people's lives have been wrecked? So I think you do it. And going to the lady around whether we're talking about a hedonistic policy or a public health policy, I think at the moment we've got a hedonistic policy, haven't we? But I would far rather we went through and had a public health policy and an individual, because I think we have to protect the individual as well. But I think it's not about a hedonistic, not about we don't want you to do it because it makes you feel good. We don't want you to do it because it's going to risk harming you or society.
Well, yes, I need to try and respond to that. The difficulty we've got is the Daily Mail. I mean, all All politicians will tell you that. But 77% of MPs who are very mindful about their constituents, 77% of MPs want to see drug policy reform. So that's a democratic thing. But all the political parties are fearful about stepping out in front because the Daily Mail will get them. And that is because Paul Dacre, the editor, is very good at picking up on a few cases, and I'm very, very sympathetic to the problems that Alex talked about. The fact is, cannabis and psychosis, it's a complicated issue, but there is masses of research on that, if I can quickly deal with that in a way. And it is quite contradictory, it's very unclear, because of course if you have the early negative symptoms of something like schizophrenia, you're going to feel a bit alienated and peculiar, and you will take cannabis, and you will then, of course, get the florid symptoms. And so the sort of whole cause and effect thing is quite complicated. But that is not to deny that there are people who are damaged by taking cannabis. Cannabis is not a good thing, and I'm quite sure the stronger stuff is a good deal more dangerous, which is why I want some change in policies. So I don't want to see a technocratic stitch-up, but at the same time, we are damaging large numbers of our young people, large percentages of our young people, because we're putting them in prison instead of enabling them to get treatment, and because we're leaving them to take legal highs, when some tweaks to our policies on traditional drugs would lessen their incentive to sit in their front room, having taken their mother's credit card and bought these legal highs. So, you know, as a set of politicians, I think it's very irresponsible not to do what we now know would be actually beneficial for large numbers of people. And politicians are not good, actually, at taking leadership and really getting out there and arguing for a difficult, arguing for policies in a very difficult policy area. Another one that came up only today is the issue of closing hospitals. Another third rail issue. Politicians, they don't lead, they just follow.
Yeah, well,
you know,
I think in defending the charge of that you're not being anti-democratic, I think that maintaining that the free press is standing in the way of the good functioning of democracy is I don't think it's settled that question. But that is another debate we're going to be looking at over the course of the weekend.
On that Daily Mail and populism question, there was the Professor Nutt's Drugs Advisory Council did conduct a little bit of research into public opinion. It's not one of the things they're known for, but if I recall, it found very interestingly that the majority, I can't remember exactly what percentage, the majority of polled public preferred the idea not of decriminalising cannabis, but of raising it to a Class A drug, whilst at the same time saying users shouldn't be prosecuted. That's not the Daily Mail speaking, that's your opinion poll.
Well, we had Peter Kellner come to talk to our APPG recently, and in fact the views on decriminalisation and you know, sensible change are very evenly balanced these days. There has been quite a shift over the last 10 years, actually.
Okay, I think if the panel are happy, I think I'm going to wrap up there.
Well done, Claire.
Just